spirit of the give and take of free individual contracts, the tremendous power of organization has combined great aggregations of capital in enormous industrial establishments working through vast agencies of commerce and employing great masses of men in movements of production and transportation and trade, so great in the mass that each individual concerned in them is quite helpless by himself. The relations between the employer and the employed, between the owners of aggregated capital and the units of organized labor, between the small producer, the small trader, the consumer, and the great transporting and manufacturing and distributing agencies, all present new questions for the solution of which the old reliance upon the free action of individual wills appears quite inadequate. And in many directions, the intervention of that organized control which we call government seems necessary to produce the same result of justice and right conduct which obtained through the attrition of individuals before the new conditions arose.
Welcome back to another class session on the history of U.S. labor struggles. If this is your first time joining us, this series aims to provide some insight on current labor issues by looking back on the historic labor struggles and tactics inflicted upon the American working class. I am your host and Dean of Freedom University, Aaron Stockton. Today's session is part 2 of our preamble, which will act as an introduction for a 1991 National Institute of Health study on healthcare's link to employment. The crises that Americans faced during the 1930s and 1940s parallel the crises we are facing in 2020. Environmental calamity, economic collapse, and a major world war, all after just coming out of the First World War and a flu pandemic that decimated 1/3 of the world's population. I believe the topics covered in this preamble will serve as an example of the radical legislation and initiatives needed to help the people of the U.S. ensure their and the nation's survival in times like the moment we are currently facing. The entirety of this preamble will focus on specific New Deal legislation implemented by the late President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and I have released the full recordings of his fireside chats, and excerpts will be presented as part of the production of this series. I would like to invite you to the People Class Podcast Patreon, Twitter, SoundCloud, Anchor, and Facebook pages. Download and listen to the recordings in their entirety. In part 1 of this preamble, we were introduced to the New Deal of 1933, which gave us the NRA, the National Recovery Administration, the Public Works Administration, Civilian Conservation Corps, the Civilian Works Administration, the Farm Security Administration, the National Industrial Recovery Act of 1933, and the Social Security Act. As we continue into part 2 of our preamble, I would like to take a look at the U.S. government's role in regulating prices in the economy. The U.S. embassies, an outline of the U.S. economy, can be found on their website, credits 18th century renowned Scottish economist and philosopher Adam Smith as the father of modern-day capitalism. Smith's ideology was that private interests functioned separate from government intervention within a free, competitive market. He promoted the idea that private self-interest would work for the common good of society. Smith also advocated the French's laissez-faire approach of government. Laissez-faire meaning leave it alone or let it be. Smith had a remarkable faith in the benevolence of private interests if he truly believed the words he inked in his 1776 book, The Wealth of Nations, which holds as much reverence by economists and capitalists as the Holy Bible by the Christians or the Quran by the Nation of Islam. So, the U.S. government essentially stayed out of the affairs of private industry, aside from the lobbying and bribery of the wealthiest capitalists, which birthed the era of robber barons and monopolies. We here in the United States are intimately aware of the failures of unfettered capitalism with a government that has no interest in regulation because it was just easier that way. That was a long-winded approach to tell you that in the way of government intervention in regulating the economy, historically, there has not been any in the U.S. That was until our first brush with the harsh, wide-scale failures of capitalism via the stock market crash of 1929. One doesn't have to ponder for too long before concluding the stock market crash that spawned the Great Depression was a result of predatory, opportunist capitalists. It was not until the U.S. economy was almost decimated and the population began to drop due to record levels of suicide, a result of the massive unemployment that drove so many families into despair, homelessness, and starvation. The social unrest caused by the Great Depression was compounded by an ecological crisis as well, created by the effects of overproduction in the agriculture industry and, quite frankly, some bad timing. The Great Plains region of the United States was suffering the worst drought in recorded history at the time. This event drove an estimated 2.5 million out-of-work farmers and agricultural workers out of the rural areas of Texas, New Mexico, Colorado, Nebraska, Kansas, and Oklahoma into the metropolitan and suburban spaces in search for gainful employment. In the way of government intervention, FDR was forced to act. The government reached their influence into the private industry sector to provide relief. One of those ways, NERA, which we talked about in our previous session, provided economic aid by regulating the sale of stocks, by establishing the NRA. We briefly glossed over the NRA in our last session, but let's go ahead and take a look at it now. The National Recovery Administration, or NRA, was established in 1933. If you remember from last session, the NRA aimed to eliminate cutthroat competition by facilitating cooperation between industry, labor, and government to draft codes of fair practices and set minimum prices that products could be sold. This evened out the playing field for smaller businesses who did not have the benefit of purchasing power. For the worker, the NRA set the first minimum wage standards and maximum allowable work hours for a week. Not to totally discredit the U.S. government and their laissez-faire approach completely, as they had made some moral efforts to protect small businesses and the working class consumers from predatory capitalism by way of the Sherman Antitrust Act, which was signed into law in 1890. And the Sherman Antitrust Act declared that no person or business could monopolize trade or could combine or conspire with someone else to restrict trade. The Sherman Antitrust Act prohibited every contract, combination, or conspiracy in restraint of trade, and any monopolization, attempted monopolization, or conspiracy to monopolize. That was the definition given by the FTC at ftc.gov. The act was brought into play to break up monopolies like Rockefeller, Standard Oil. So the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890 did have some holes in it, some glaring ones. It was later amended in 1914 with the Clayton Act, which mandated that, quote, all persons considering a merger or acquisition above a certain size must notify both the Antitrust Division and the Federal Trades Commission, which was established simultaneously. Now, what isn't usually mentioned, especially in mainstream media and discussions regarding antitrust attempts in the U.S., was the amazing contributions the act made to the working class. The brainchild of Alabama Congressman Henry Clayton in 1914, not only did it outlaw practices of price discrimination and anti-competitive mergers and the restraint of trade, the appendage exempted laborers from fines and imprisonment if they were the causes of such outcomes. So ultimately, through the Clayton Antitrust Act of 1914, peaceful strikes, picketing, boycotts, and labor unions were declared illegal and federally protected. At the time, Ohio Congressman Robert Croser warned in his support of the bill that a failure to check the growth of monopolies will result in industrial slavery. He meant that on a couple of different levels, global production level and on the individual level as a working class person, right? We have seen the evolution of lack of enforcement or regulation of business and what that's led to, but not to ramble here. So once again, along with the Clayton Antitrust Act, which acted as a addendum, amendment, appendage, whatever you'd like to call it, to the Sherman Antitrust Act, the Federal Trade Commission was created the same year. The FTC prohibited unfair methods of competition and unfair or deceptive acts or practices in business. So the Clayton and Federal Trade Commission Act were intended to work as catch-alls for the loopholes and oversights the Sherman Antitrust Act failed to address in its final implementation. Let's look at these entities just a little closer, shall we? So the FTC has many branches or bureaus that handle the many nuances of regulating industry. The first of those bureaus is the Bureau of Competition. It is the arm of the FTC that enforces the nation's antitrust laws. And they also have an antitrust division of the Department of Justice, which enforces all criminal antitrust offenses. FTC.gov explains that the Bureau of Competition investigates potential law violations and seeks legal remedies in federal court or before the FTC's administrative law judges. The Bureau also serves as a resource for policymakers on competition issues and works closely with foreign competition agencies to promote sound and consistent outcomes in the international arena. Consistent outcomes. Something the conservative right always lambasts. Their argument that guaranteeing consistent outcomes is antithetical to the idea of a free market. So anyway, an example of the work the Bureau of Competition is tasked with is showcased on their website in a 2015 report that announced the FTC was opposed to and filed an administrative complaint against the merging of Cisco and U.S. Foods. Now, understand these were two of the nation's premier and still are two of the nation's premier and competing food service distribution brands. Their products are virtually everywhere. Schools, restaurants, hotels, hospitals, you name it. The FTC utilizes authority, citing a fear that the merger would limit consumer choice and therefore harm the consumer by inflating the price of their products and services. That is the Bureau of Competition. Now, the second arm of the FTC is the Bureau of Consumer Protection. Now, a lot of you may be familiar with this, okay? Now, FTC.gov lists the scope of responsibility of the Bureau of Consumer Protection, and they are tasked with the following: ceasing unfair, deceptive, and fraudulent business practices by collecting complaints and conducting investigations, opening lawsuits against companies and people that break the law, crafting the policies that maintain a fair marketplace, and educating consumers and businesses about their rights and their responsibilities. So an example of a case that the Bureau of Consumer Protection may oversee are cases such as like bait and switch or price gouging. Now, this is not to confuse the Bureau of Consumer Protection with the Better Business Bureau or the BBB. You see this plastered on the advertisements of so many companies these days. Understand that the BBB, the Better Business Bureau, is a separate private agency not affiliated with the U.S. government. They run off of an honor system of sorts, one in which the members come to an accord on acceptable standards through a practice of industry self-regulation. Last but not least is the Bureau of Economics. And their jurisdiction lies in self-analyzing and self-evaluating the impact of the Federal Trade Commission as a whole on the U.S. economy. They also provide economic analysis for competition and consumer protection investigations, rulemakings, and government regulations on businesses and consumers. I would like to take a detour, if you would allow me, to outline the importance of the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890. A monopoly is not only a Parker Brothers or Hasbro game, and that's a modern day example of a merger or business acquisition. How many of you have noticed that the Monopoly game box now has the Hasbro logo plastered on it? I digress. A monopoly is a business or businesses that have total control over a sector of the economy, including prices. So some of you may be asking, what is an antitrust act? Once again, a remarkable question. Before I explain an antitrust, I will explain what a trust is. And I trust you will not need a more in-depth explanation after this. Encyclopedia.com defines trusts as the organization of several businesses in the same industry, and by joining forces, the trust controls production and distribution of a product or service, thereby limiting competition. So in essence, an antitrust opposes or is antithetical to the concept of a few business elites consolidating their power and utilizing their wealth and influence to control the free market. When these trust organizations are established, all of the profits, bribe money, financial entitlements, etc., are shored up and kept safe in their coffers through a legal entity called a trust fund. It acts as a central holding for property or assets on behalf of another person, group, or organization. That is the definition of a trust fund. Understand that what it holds can include many things. It could be money, property, stock, a business, or a combination of those assets. This is how the elite secure their wealth and monopolies are created. They hire someone called a lobbyist, build their numbers and influence, build a coalition of businesses, and set forth to ensure each partner in the endeavor are financially made for life in true socialist fashion. What is a lobbyist? I'm glad you asked. Oxford defines a lobbyist as a person who takes part in an organized attempt to influence legislators. Simple as that. This is a recognized legal profession where a corporation can essentially buy and own an individual and use them as liaison or middleman to bribe and make sweetheart deals with politicians. The corporation's true agendas are usually presented to the public under the guise of improvements to education, environmental responsibility, or some sort of common societal good. I like to illustrate an example of how lobbying works. Please don't crucify me if I don't have a bunch of details and nuance here. This is just a quick and dirty example. Let's say you live in a city where a foreign corporate investor has plans to open up factories and distribution centers. They galvanize the impoverished community with news reports of opening up a factory and creating jobs in their town. The people are excited because they have gained access to a new stream of income. Then the hiring campaign begins to run in the media. Reports saturate the morning and nightly news. Scenes of people waiting in line for applications play on repeat. Meanwhile, the town has a bad problem with their water infrastructure, and it is known that the drinking water contains abhorrent levels of lead and other poisons due to government neglect. But the residents of said town cannot divert the clean drinking water from the very lake that a foreign corporate investor uses into their potable water supply owned by the state, because that processing factory in which those very residents work is drawing that water for profit. So understand, behind the scenes, the lobbyists are the secret hidden in plain sight, advocating on behalf of the owners of industry and campaign donors. At this stage of the game, you cannot ignore the fact that legislation passed by the corporation's behest only depreciates the quality of life for the working class individual. We are seeing the gradual decline into a free fall for over the past 40 years in the US. And we have reached terminal velocity in 2020. So how is this legal? Herein lies the problem with allowing money in politics. In 1995, the US Congress passed the Lobbying Disclosure Act of 1995. It was presented through the mainstream media as the government's attempt to show some semblance of transparency. I guess the conscientious objectors who opposed the Korean and Vietnam Wars began to inject a culture of distrust of government, the mainstream US culture. This is what propelled comedian George Carlin into fame. You probably have and probably will continue to hear this term floating around, circulating, especially throughout the mainstream media now, dark money, especially during campaign seasons. There are, in 21st century America, a class of individuals who are exempt from revealing the sources of their campaign donations, unlike everyone else. I'll be sure to cover lobbying in future sessions, so just be sure to tune in for that. Alas, this is ultimately where the problem of poverty and wealth inequality seeps through the illusion of economic prosperity here in North America. As wealth is usually accumulated through inheritance through various means, property, land, liquid and illiquid assets, businesses, etc. Historically, the U.S. working class has never had an opportunity to acquire such wealth throughout the many generations their families have resided on this continent. So you have to wrap your brain around the fact that the modern day U.S. working class as it exists today, albeit impoverished, was a slow, painful, and incremental evolution from indentured servitude and slavery, specifically for Africans, in which many wealthy 18th century business owners crossed the Atlantic with their human property to pursue the involuntarily free labor, fertilized money tree that grew to the West. As from the mid to late 18th century, the majority of the industrialized world began to shift away from inhumane forced labor practices and began to outlaw slavery and indentured servitude. They began to experiment with alternative methods of economic governance, feudalism, lord serf, socialism, communism, and various other incarnations of capitalism. The American working class is essentially still fledgling and waning now. Going back to the Sherman Antitrust Act and trust, here's a breakdown of how trusts, aided by wealth inequality, have helped to facilitate capitalism's current vile incarnation. Corporations of a particular industry combine with the goal of being the predominant, if not the only merchant in a region. In doing this, they form a trust. Deals are then made between the government and the corporate trust to ensure the trust gets closer to achieving its ultimate goal, which is market domination. In these negotiations between government and the corporate trust, the trust's lobbyist is tasked with persuading politicians in key positions with liquid or illiquid bribery. The politicians fall under the spell of the promises the lobbyist claims his master will fulfill if terms are met, and it is usually agreed that the assets promised to said politician will be held in a trust fund until the politician is free from his federal restrictions to claim the reward. The reward claim process comes in many forms, the most common, however, of them being upon the politician leaving office. That politician is usually promised a job in a corporation of the aforementioned trust, where he can legally claim his bribes in the form of an employment or retirement package of some sort. It wouldn't be hard to see this trend. One only has to hop online and visit sites like opensecrets.com or pay attention to the business sections of your media of preference, to see this revolving door between government and corporate industry. It's very sophisticated and corrupt stuff, people. Ultimately, what these trusts lobby for is to influence our government to deregulate the market. And deregulation simply means the government imposes and enforces less rules and restrictions on the corporation, allowing them to operate as they see fit and to hoard up as much profit as they can. I did a search for instances of the U.S. government's intervention in regulating the economy. I had hoped to be able to highlight some noteworthy cases. The reality is that the U.S. government has never done much to intervene with regulating the economy outside of the New Deal in any meaningful or beneficial way to the average working class American. There are a couple of good faith attempts there, but what I saw was a pattern. The U.S. government has historically maintained their laissez-faire, let-it-be style of governing until corporate interests have collapsed the economy. Worse than that, the regulation that has occurred more often than not has been deregulation. Deregulation is another topic that will be discussed in further detail in a future session as well, but I want to ensure that you understand the full scope of the approaching series here. The Sherman Antitrust and Federal Trade Commission Acts were indeed noteworthy attempts by the U.S. government to impose some standardization and regulation on the unfettered free market. They have led to avenues for consumers to seek justice for reparations if they are harmed by a business practice. And in its ideology, it aims to even the playing field in businesses and consumer competition. Looking at the state of America in 2020, it just goes to prove that the laws and regulations are only as good as the people enforcing them. As we approach the end of our session, I would like to make it very clear how and why healthcare is tied to employment. There was not necessarily some grand, sinister scheme to use it as a tool of oppression, although that is what healthcare has been co-opted to be in modern-day America. It was a matter of having lazy leaders running the country. It cost them too much brain power and number crunching and actual labor to formulate a solution. On the flip side of that coin, the greedy capitalists took over the government. It all comes down to this. Healthcare is tied to employment because of laissez-faire style of governing, and flipping the bill for the healthcare of a nation affects their bottom line. Thank you for joining me for this History of U.S. Labor Struggles class session. If you missed part 1 of this preamble, I'd like to invite you to go ahead and give it a listen. Please check back in for part 3 and our conclusion to this preamble, focusing on how healthcare was handled before the Great Depression. So once again, these aren't meant to be deep dives rather than an introduction to some of the important concepts that will be explored in a 1991 National Institute of Health study entitled Employment and Health Benefits, A Connection at Risk, a study I would like to present to you in its entirety. Once again, thank you for listening in here. This was your host, the Dean, and you have been listening to another class session presented from the sprawling campus of Freedom University. Freedom University. That's FU to the corrupt politicians out there. Enjoy the rest of your day, and thank you for tuning in to another session of the People Class Podcast, the official podcast of the People Class. I hope you found the information shared in today's session enlightening, or at the very least, raise some questions. I extend an invitation to join us for more weekly sessions. And remember, our work does not stop here. Get active, organize, and take control over your destiny as an American working class person. Class dismissed.
Support the unions and long live Wisconsin. It's not the left, it's not the right. It's up and down and that's the fight. It's a world of loopholes.